everyone, I hope you guys are all having a great day and I hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving and you were able to celebrate with your family and your friends. Today I am going to do a video on how I choose to rate books. I was inspired to do this video for several reasons. First of all, my husband, who loves lists, has decided to revamp how he chooses to rate books and movies, and that got me thinking about how I rate books. And also, our friends Ryan and Kristen do a podcast called Seeking Stories, and in it they sort of went into a 10-point rating system on how they choose to rate movies, and I thought that was very interesting and I thought it was very applicable to how I think about books. And finally, I watched Britta Bohler's recent video on how she chooses to rate books and what it means if she gives a book 5 stars. And I thought that was very interesting, and it made me just begin to consider more how I rate a book and what it means when I give a book 4 stars or 5 stars and things like that. And as I was watching her videos and thinking about how my friends rate their books, I realized that what it means for me is different than what it means for them. And so I thought I would share with you guys what it means to me when I rate a book 1 to 5 stars. So I'm going to start with a discussion on what I look at when I am choosing to rate a book. I think about the plot, whether or not it was entertaining and things like that, whether it was well thought out, whether it was realistic, and whether or not it had a good resolution. Good meaning, does it make sense? I also consider the setting a little bit. If the setting is pertinent to the story. I think a lot about the characters. Are these characters genuine? Do they appear realistic? Are they interesting? Because the characters are sort of what makes the book. If the characters are boring, I probably don't want to read the book. I also think a lot about the author's craft, and not just in their writing style per se, but also in how they use symbols and motifs and things like that to sort of define and support the themes overall. Included with their craft also would be their writing style and their dialogue and things like that. And finally, I consider the themes that are present in the book. These are really important to me. A book can have a great plot and have terrible themes, and it's gonna bring that rating down for me because I don't enjoy that. So those are the things that I consider when I am rating a book. One thing that I think is a little bit different for me than how Ryan and Kristen think about it, and Britta Bohler I think as well, is that they were questioning, well, would they reread it? And I don't reread books very often. I've only ever reread a few books. I will reread the Chronicles of Narnia every once in a while. I reread Harry Potter and Lord of the Rings all the time. But that's it, just those fantasy books that I fell in love with when I was much younger. Very rarely do I ever reread any other kind of book unless I'm a teacher, so like I reread Mouse and the Motorcycle almost every year because I read it to my students, or because of Winn-Dixie and things like that. So, but those aren't things that I'm choosing to reread, they're things that I'm choosing to share with my students. So that differentiates it a little bit for me. So I don't necessarily consider, oh, would I reread this book? Because I almost never do that. Okay, next I'm going to get into my actual rating system and then give examples for each of these for each of these ratings. I do choose to stick to a star system because it fits with Goodreads and it makes sense for me. I know that the negatives of that is that Goodreads does not allow you to do half stars, but just like whatever, you can put a half star in your review and then people see it. Also, on my own personal records, like on my Excel sheet that I use or in my notebooks when I'm writing about a book, I will put a half star and then I'll explain why, which I think is important. Britta Bohler mentioned this, and I think that it's a good idea, that if you don't finish a book, if I don't finish a book, I don't rate it. I think, number one, I didn't get to the end, so I'm not sure that it's fair for me to give a book a rating. Because maybe if I had finished reading, maybe I would have fallen in love with it. Who knows? But there's also the implied rating of not finishing a book. If I choose not to finish it, it wasn't worth my time. So I'm not going, so obviously it's a negative rating. So for me, not finishing a book is obviously a negative reflection on the book, but it's not fair for me to necessarily give it a star rating because I didn't finish it. Going up from there would be a 1-star read. For me, a 1-star read means that I did not enjoy it at all and I thought it was a complete and utter waste of my time. The example I'm going to share for that is The Red Queen. This is a young adult book that I don't even have on my shelf anymore because it was so bad that I sold it back almost immediately to Title Wave Books. I really hated this book, and I also objectively thought that it was just a bad book. It was very derivative of other more entertaining young adult dystopian novels. The fantasy elements to me weren't very well thought out. I also thought that the characters were terrible, they were not entertaining, they were exceptionally annoying, and they did not behave in a realistic manner. They weren't believable. Even for a fantasy book, I didn't think that this was believable. And so, for those reasons, I gave it a 1 star. I know that there are lots of people out there who probably disagree with that, but, you know, star ratings are subjective to begin with. So it's all good. Next up on the list would be 2 stars. So for me, a 2-star rating means that I did not enjoy the book, but I can see that there are worthy elements to it. An example of that for me is The Humans by Matt Haig. This book, I did a whole video on this book if you are interested in my more specific thoughts on this book, but I did not enjoy it, mostly because the characters were a little boring and the plot was sort of non-existent, and overall the themes were terrible. So I did not enjoy this book. However, I can say that this story is funny. The author is pretty insightful, and the way that he describes humanity from an alien perspective was very amusing. So I think that to an extent he achieved what he wanted to, which was make fun of the humans. However, the rest of the book for me just was not enjoyable, so it received just 2 stars. The next rating would be 3 stars, and for me, a 3-star means that it could mean one of 2 things. It could mean that I really enjoyed the book, but I know objectively it is not a good book. Or it could mean that objectively it's a stellar book, but for some reason or other I did not enjoy it. So I'm going to give 2 examples of that. The first example would be a book that I enjoyed even though objectively it's not a good book. And for me, an example of this is Fatal Voyage by Kathy Reichs. These are just like thriller, psychological mystery thriller books and the TV show Bones is based off of these books. I love the TV show Bones. I enjoy these books as well. Now, these books are not well written. The plots are unrealistic, but the science is fun, and I like the plots, no matter how unrealistic they are. No matter how many terrible, terrible things happen to this main character, I still think it's a ton of fun. So, it gets a 3-star rating. I like it even though I know it's not a good book. On the other hand, A Room with a View I gave A Room with a View 3 stars as well. A Room with a View is a classic. It is objectively a wonderful book. The writing is great. The settings are just superb. It's well written. It's hilarious. The author is just very precise in what he's trying to do, and he lets you know what he's trying to do, and I found that very entertaining and intelligent, and it's just beautifully written. So, why didn't I like it? Well, I didn't like the overall themes. I do not think that I just don't think that a rational humanistic worldview is the way to live your life. I just don't. And I also don't think that the characters truly live their life that way either. And so even though it's a beautiful, well-written classic, I did not enjoy it enough to give it 4 or 5 stars. Next on the rating scale would be 4 stars. A 4-star book is a book that I thoroughly enjoyed, that I also think is well written and is objectively a good book. However, I can identify some elements that weren't great. An example for me would be Galway Bay by Mary Pat Kelly. This is historical fiction about the Irish potato famine and also about Irish immigrants who moved to America during that time period. I really enjoyed most of the elements of this story. I thought it had a very entertaining and engaging plot. I felt that the characters were well developed, most of them anyway, and I just enjoyed the historical fiction elements of it. It was very well researched. As usual, there's a romance in it that's not perfect, but it has this mystical element to it that I enjoyed as well. So, as a book, I thoroughly enjoyed it. The writer's craft isn't perfect, but it's still pretty good. I felt like the symbols and themes were well developed. My biggest critique of this book would be the pacing. It's such a long book, and I'd say the first 2/3 of it flow really well, but towards the end, once they're in America, the pacing just changes a little bit. Some parts go by too quickly, some parts don't get enough attention, but on the other hand, some parts really drag, and I'm like, no, I don't really need to read about this. I'm not interested or entertained at all. So overall, I really enjoyed this book, and I think it's just a good, solid historical fiction book. So 4 stars. The final rating would be 5 stars. For me, this means a book that is objectively awesome, and I enjoyed it. So the example I'm going to share with you today is Kristen Hanna's The Great Alone. This book is about Alaska, so it captured my heart immediately. Plus, it's a gorgeous cover, but none of that is why it's great. This book has wonderful, well-written, well-thought-out, true characters. The setting is so well described. I live in Alaska, so when the setting is described, I can look out my window and say, oh yes, that's perfect, that's exactly what it's like. And also the plot was well thought out and entertaining, even though part of the plot is driven forward by a bit of teenage stupidity, and I normally wouldn't enjoy that in a book, but even that teenage stupidity is steeped in truth. It's genuinely how a couple of teenagers would respond and react in this situation, because sometimes teenagers can be dumb. No harsh feelings, it's just the truth. So everything about the story had just this strong element of truth to it that just makes it so good. I can identify one element that I didn't enjoy very much is that on 1 or 2 occasions I felt that Kristen Hanna was repetitive in the way that she describes the sunlight in Alaska in the summertime. And it's a reasonable thing to repeat. It's noticeable. The amount of daylight in Alaska in the summertime is noticeable, let's just be honest. However, she doesn't describe it in a particularly artful way, and I think because it just made it noticeable that she was, I think 4 or 5 times in that many pages, she describes, oh, and it was sunlight all the time. Oh, and it was sunlight all the time. And oh, I couldn't sleep because it was sunlight all the time. And I just found just that one little piece was, could have been improved, maybe. But overall, all of the other elements were great. All of those other elements that I care about were really wonderful. And I will say that this is a book that I probably will read again, although the reason I will read it again is because I love Alaska, not necessarily because the book so accurately describes this place that I love. I'm going to want to come back and revisit it often, especially after we leave here. My husband's in the Army, so we're going to be leaving in, who knows, really. But when I leave here, I'm going to want to come back to this setting over and over again, and this book is going to be one way that I do it. So while I don't typically reread books, I probably will be rereading this one eventually. So that's how I choose to rate a book. I know that everybody's a little bit different with this, and one of the interesting things is that a 3-star book for me doesn't mean the same thing as a 3-star book for other readers. So I would love to know what you guys think, and I think it would be very interesting if other YouTubers decided to do a video on how they rate books as well. So I hope you guys all have a great day, and I will see you soon. Bye.